Y'all ready for the jury?
Yes, sir.
All right, bring them on.
All jurors present, Your Honor.
All right, very good. Your next witness.
Judge, defense calls Dr. Andy Morgan.
Do you swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court and the jury in the trial of this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Thank you.
Please state your first and last name and spell your last name loudly.
Okay. My first name is Charles Alexander Morgan III. Oh, that's my last name, Morgan, sorry.
Good afternoon, Dr. Morgan.
Good afternoon.
What do you do for a living?
A number of things. I'm a professor. I am a researcher. I do operational psychology for the Department of Defense. And I'm a forensic psychiatrist, so I evaluate people for attorneys who are going to court in either civil or criminal cases.
Where did you get your education?
Yes. After high school, I attended college. I got my bachelor's degree from Pacific Union College in Angwin, California. I majored in French. I didn't know I was going to be a doctor. My parents reminded me that's what I was going to do, so I went to medical school. I graduated from Loma Linda University School of Medicine in 1986. And then in medicine, once you get your doctoral degree, you do an internship year to be licensed as a physician. I decided to specialize in psychiatry and transferred to Yale University, where I finished my training and joined the Faculty of Medicine at Yale University in the Department of Psychiatry. After that, I specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder. At Yale, Congress had created an entity called the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress. So the U.S. Congress wanted to know, is this a real disease? How does stress affect the brain? What is the neurobiology? Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. What is the neurobiology of the condition? And our team at Yale, we were tasked mainly with doing experiments, working with patients to try and understand how stress affects decision-making, memory, and physiology to try and better understand an illness that we could develop treatments for. Following that, I got a master's degree in history of medicine and science from Yale and taught in both departments, psychiatry and history of medicine. And then in 2001, I respecialized in forensic psychiatry, so I took a year off to do additional training. That was the end of my formal academic training, and I was a forensic psychiatrist. And then in 2003, I was hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to be a medical intelligence officer, and I served there for 7 years. I was still working at the university at the time, but I was a senior research scientist at the CIA, focused on the Detecting Deception program. So over the years, I teach in the areas of stress, anxiety, how your brain works, how memory and decision-making work under stress, and also in areas of memory and lying and truth-telling. And in areas of memory and then lying and truth-telling.
And do you currently hold a faculty position anywhere?
I do. I'm also currently now a faculty member at the University of New Haven in the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice in our Department of National Security. And in that capacity, I teach both undergraduate and graduate students who are working on either their BA degree or their master's degree or their PhD in areas related to national security. So some want to become intelligence officers, and I primarily teach in that lane on how to do intelligence analysis, how to think critically about things, and also how to design research for national security. Whereas over at Yale, my students are mainly doctors who already have their degree and they're specializing in psychiatry or developing their training in forensic psychiatry. So 2 different hats, 2 different worlds.
And have you ever written or published any papers regarding your research into the cognitive function?
Yes, I have over 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers.
And what about any grants or special awards that you've gotten in the field?
I've received a number of grants, either from the National Institute of Mental Health, from the Department of Defense, from the Defense Intelligence Agency, from the FBI, from an organization called CIFA, which no longer exists. It existed for a little while, but when Rumsfeld was no longer the Secretary of Defense, that organization closed. But over the years, I've had grants requiring about $2 million to look at stress. I currently have a grant from the United States Air Force looking at lying and truth-telling about beliefs, and then one from Lockheed Martin that is examining the role of culture and influence in Twitter. With respect to awards, I was awarded the Patriot Award in 2008 for my service to the Army and the nature of my research, leading to something people could do differently for soldiers who've had stress, which was quite humbling to get, actually. And I received the Sir Henry Wellcome Prize from the American Academy of Surgeons, again, for developing interventions for people under stress. At Yale, I also received an award for, as a teacher, as a clinical faculty member, training students and doctors in training, which was wonderful to get. I like so.
What does it mean when it says that you're when you hold yourself out as a diplomat in the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology?
In my profession, if you graduate from medical school and you complete 4 years of training in psychiatry, you can hang out a shingle and start your practice. If you go into academia, which is about 5% of psychiatrists go on to take these exams. They're called national board examinations. So we take written exams, and then 2 years after we've been in practice, we have to sit before a panel, not as many as you, but at least 6 senior people in the field of psychiatry, and we examine patients in front of them and discuss what we think is wrong, what we would do, and if they're satisfied with the depth of your knowledge, you become a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. The university likes that because it means we represent the top 5% of people in our field. for psychiatry and what we do and what we know.
Very good. Have you ever testified in court before?
I have, yes.
And state court, federal court? Tell us a little bit.
When back in the 1990s, between 1990 and 98, I testified routinely in state courts in Connecticut and outside of Connecticut, mainly related to post-traumatic stress disorder. Once I specialized in forensic psych in 2001, I testified both in state courts and in federal courts around a wide range of issues, from criminal responsibility to downward departure, sort of helping the jury think about what might be wrong with the person they have to make a judgment about, to describe, does a person suffer from a mental illness or not, and if so, how that might be relevant to helping the court understand them. I've also testified internationally at the International Tribunal for War Crimes in The Hague.
And do you testify mostly in civil or criminal cases? And if so, mostly for the plaintiff or defense, or the prosecution or the defense?
With respect to the prosecution or the defense, it is about 50-50. Last year it was 60-40 for the prosecution versus the defense. This year, with 3 cases, it's been more for the defense than the prosecution, but over the last 20 years, when I look at them, it splits about 50-50. Over the last 3 years, I would say I've done more civil cases. After being I was on the National Academy of Science Committee for Eyewitness Identification Reform. And when we released that report, I guess then a lot of people thought, okay, that's the person we can call about eyewitness testimony. So more recently, the calls have been about criminal cases dealing with eyewitness identification.
And I believe I saw that you have been appointed to a case involving an Army person named Bo Bergdahl, is that correct?
Yes, I've been retained in that case right now.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense would tender Dr. Morgan as an expert in forensic psychiatry and cognitive performance under stress.
Says the state. So qualified. He's so qualified.
Now, Dr. Morgan, last night, you and I met, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you gave me a rather extensive deck of slides, is that correct?
I did. I did, as a matter of fact. I have a habit of making lots of slides.
And were these slides made specifically for this case?
No, the slides are drawn from 2 different lectures I routinely use in teaching medical students, psychiatric residents, and now some of my students at UNH about the nature of the human brain, how it responds under stress, how your memory works and doesn't work at times, and the aspects of the brain that are involved in decision making.
And once you assemble that deck of slides, then I went through them last night and then again this morning and gave you a sort of a skinny version of that deck of slides, or have come up with a skinnier version, is that correct?
That's correct.
And would those slides help you to explain how you reach your conclusions to the jury?
In the past, I have found that it is useful for people to see images because most people don't actually know really what your brain looks like and how it operates. So I try and use visual aids whenever I can. So I would love to be able to use them. They help me explain what I think and what I know to people.
And were those slides assembled based on the testimony that you heard yesterday in this case when you were in the courtroom?
I would say 98% of them were not. There were a couple of slides I made last night summarizing some key ideas that we know when we put the science data all together that I thought were relevant to comment on when I was here.
And could we mark this for identification as a given? And I shared these slides with the solicitor this morning, and they have had a chance to look at them. However, I believe that they will have an objection to the slides, and I'd like to go ahead and...
Question or an argument? Or
it's not an argument, Your Honor. What I'd like to do is introduce introduce for identification defense exhibit defense exhibit number 103, and see if you recognize these.
All right. Is there, you started with some comments about the solicitor objecting or not objecting. Is there an objection?
Yes, Your Honor, due to late disclosure pursuant to previous rulings, and we had, I thought, reached an agreement that these weren't going to be referenced at all. I'm a little surprised that they being discussed, but yes, we do have an objection to the late disclosure and direct violation of the
And Your Honor, these are not slides in the nature of the substance of a specific report prepared in these cases, but rather generic teaching type slides that were provided to us last night. We provided them to the solicitor for their review, and we'd be happy to let the court look at the slides if the court would like to do so.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have you go to the jury room for a few minutes. And what is it you want me to look at, and what might I gain from looking at it?
Your Honor, I don't know that you would gain anything from looking at it. I know that in the past, the court has wanted to see an exhibit before they rule on the objection, and just wanted to offer the court the opportunity to see the exhibit before they
All right.
rule on the objection.
Yes, sir.
And, Your Honor, may I approach?
Sure. They may be used for demonstrative purposes.
Thank you, Madam Rich.
Yes, sir. All right, anything else before the jury comes back? All right. Let's just stand and stretch for a moment while we have an opportunity to do so. And you can bring the jury while we're getting a little stretch.
Oh, wait, no, I haven't been able to quite figure it out.
Fix them some water.
I was thinking, when I was pouring it, not much was coming out, but maybe I'm overeducated,
I'll read you some,
and I can't
and I'm gonna read this.
figure that out.
I'm gonna read this with you.
Oh, okay.
And if you look at the slide, I'll just go through it. If we can skip one, skip.
We'll just give it, sure.
Can't touch it.
Sorry.
Thank you.
She distinguishes. On the court reporter, these are for identification. How do you know the difference?
I have a list.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the ID on the. All right. They're admitted for demonstrative purposes.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Morgan, I believe you have a brief exhibit or display for the jury that kind of will help explain your work with the brain. Is that true?
Yes,
Okay.
that's the intent. So, do I point this in any particular direction? So when I talk to my students about the brain, I say we all have one. We usually just don't think about it very much. And so I'd like you to try something. I do this with all my students, and just say, you can see 6 different cards. Have a look at each of them. Think about one of them. Don't tell your neighbor. Just think about that one card. I'm going to find the card in your mind, so don't say anything. Have you got a card? Don't say what it is. Just nod if you got one. Now I just want you to bring that image up in your mind. Focus in on it. So for most people, when they look at it, it takes them a minute to figure out what just happened. When you think about this, no one's card is there. Any card you picked at the beginning is gone. This is called selective attention bias, and it's a way our brains always work. We just don't always notice it because it doesn't get us in too much trouble. But at the beginning, when we tell you to focus on something, whether it's on a moving object, whether it's a person, whether it's a card, what your brain accepts is the task, and you focus in on it, and you're supposed to memorize that, and you disattend to all the other cards because you've seen cards before. But your brain does not work like a camera. So most people, when they get to the end, they're a little surprised when their card's gone because they don't actually remember what all the other cards were, even though you saw them for several slides in a row, but they're not important to your brain. So the information is not retained. So some people do this for entertainment, like a magic trick online, but the purpose of it is to illustrate how our brain works in a small way, that when you zero in on something, you disattend to anything that's not considered immediately relevant. It's not stored in your memory. It's not retained over time. It doesn't turn into long-term memory. Your brain dumps it. And this is something that's a little counterintuitive because I know I have a good memory. I believe what I remember, and I don't know what I don't remember, unless somebody else, like my spouse, reminds me. But this is one little example of a quirk of a way our brain works. And that quirk gets worse under stress, along with a number of other things.
And Dr. Morgan, that leads me into the next question. You have done research about the functioning of the brain under stress,
I have.
and who do you use as the subjects for your research?
We use regular civilians. We use active duty military personnel. We use law enforcement personnel. We'll use patients, depending on the nature of the study of what we're doing. So in my work, early on, I divided most of my research between people who had served in a war zone and seen lots of combat, people who had served in a war zone who had not seen combat, and people in civilian life who'd never been in the military, never seen combat, and who were healthy. And then we also use people in our studies who suffer from specific kinds of mental disorders, like panic disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder or schizophrenia. And we do that so we can begin to understand the ways in which we are all very different when we get under stress.
And Dr. Morgan, the title of that slide would indicate that there are actual physical responses that take place in the brain.
Yes,
during
indeed.
stress?
Yes, in your body and your brain.
Explain to the jury?
Yes. So may I stand up with a pointer?
Yes.
It'd be helpful so I can do this. So this is a picture of your brain. And what this is referring to, this is your adrenal gland. It's not really sitting next to your brain in your body. It's sitting on top of your kidneys. So when you're under stress and you recognize the threat, we say your fear and alarm system gets activated. And the main areas that it gets activated in are in this brain stem area and this little area of brain right over here. You see that word amygdala? The amygdala actually sits right down here. If you could take your finger and poke it through your eye and slightly over, your fingertip would finally poke it. You could go right in through your eyeball right here. We're very much like mice, rats, monkeys, and anybody else in the wiring of this system. If you recognize a threat, it triggers and it begins to release norepinephrine and epinephrine. The first volley of it through your sympathetic nervous system is really coming from your central nervous system, but that's not sufficient. So your brain sends a signal to the adrenal gland on top of your kidneys to say, release a bunch of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And that circulates in your body, but it's a little slower. So I don't know if you've ever nearly been in a car accident or had something scary happen, but it happens really fast and then you find you're shaking. It's because that adrenaline has finally hit. And you'll say, well, it's over, but why am I still shaking? Because the hormone response in your body is slower than the immediate response in your brain. It takes a little while. But our bodies seem to be designed that way so that we can respond really quickly and then get backup support from the circulating hormones in our body. And so this system right in here, this is the part where we do a lot of thinking. This is all very automatic. It's very, very, very quick, and it's right at the threshold of consciousness. So in our studies, when we look at how fast it takes to alarm your amygdala, it can happen in the blink of an eye. It's not a conscious decision to be afraid of something. It's an automatic response, and it takes a lot of work to shut your amygdala down. But when it fires, this is the important part, is that it raises your heart rate, your blood pressure, your skin may get clammy. What your body's doing when it releases cortisol and adrenaline, because cortisol is also released from the adrenal gland. It's a fancy name. It's a little like prednisone. It's a really important chemical in our body. In animals, we call it corticosterone. But its main function when it's released, besides the adrenaline, is to mobilize glucose. That's your body and your brain's main source of energy. And your body shunts your blood flow to your big muscle groups, and inside your brain, there's a huge surge of norepinephrine that activates all the rehearsal areas of your brain, and it tends to shut down all these slow thinking parts of your brain.
And Dr. Morgan, if I may,
Yeah.
what is a rehearsal area?
It might be easier. Do you have my other brain?
I have your other brain here, yes.
This might be easier than on the slide. I can
Why
show
don't
you
Why
where.
don't you step
Oh,
down?
perfect.
Why don't you stand in front of the jury so that they can...
So this is my other brain. The way that this is not anatomically correct is you can't see all the blood vessels that sit and wrap around your brain. But we use this in teaching. And the bright areas, so our brain's organized. If you've never seen pictures what we know specifically in animals and is that this part of your brain needs to be functioning when you learn a new skill and when you're really thinking carefully about something. This is where you're doing that slow, deliberative reasoning. When you finally turn something into a habit, if you've trained on something over and over again, it's really controlled by little cells right in this area and this area. So once and this is a really good thing, because in rats, mice, monkeys, and people, if we raise people's adrenaline really high, we can do that in the lab by giving people a drug called Yohimbe. You can buy it in a health food store. It helps some people with their sexual function. But the main thing is that it's really increasing norepinephrine in your body and your brain. And it has a really important side effect. When norepinephrine goes really high when you're under stress, this part of your brain goes away. Because this is too slow to save your life. The only way this model is inaccurate is this little bit right here should have stayed sticking right there. So what happens under stress when the adrenaline hits, and we've seen it on brain scans, I'll show you some pictures later when we have people try and make a drawing, your frontal lobe is gone, and adrenaline gets high enough. And this is what you're really functioning on under stress. So one of the reasons why, like with the military folks, when we do selection and we look at training, the reason why we make people train like they're going to fight, the reason why we have doctors in the hospital practice over and over and over again, or we learn a checklist, is because we're not smart under stress. Everybody gets dumb. No one gets smarter under stress. I just get dumb faster so they wouldn't grow. Is one way I think about it. But what you're hoping is through your training, you're preserving the ingrained patterns of what you practice. So when this part's gone, this part you'll resort to doing whatever you learned how to do. We call it habit. We call it your more long-standing ways of behaving. And that's true in mice, it's true in rats, it's true in monkeys, and it's true in us. It's not very flattering when you first look at it, but it's a really good thing because in many circumstances, if you hesitate, you die. So military folks, when we talk to them, they don't want an analyst in charge. They look at me and they go, Doc, you overthink everything. You know, that would be analysis paralysis, where you'll still be looking at the thing that's going to get us killed, trying to figure out what it is. So the people we select for those lines of work are people who don't overanalyze everything and can learn how to respond quickly under high states of adrenaline. But this is really, really consistent what we know about when hormones go up. And I think my students are usually shocked. But these areas of your brain are really important. Your amygdala, that I pointed to a little while ago, is right up in there. I can get my finger right in the middle of the yellow. And it is the key center in your brain that lets you recognize when you're in trouble. People who are born with a defect in the amygdala, there's only been about 8 or 9 people documented in the science community who have a defect in their amygdala from birth. They are unable to recognize fear. They don't know what they're in trouble for. They can't do fear conditioning. They can't learn to be afraid of something. So it's very maladaptive. For people who have strokes in those areas, or if in non-human animals we damage that area on purpose, they become unable to learn fear or to extinguish fear. You have to activate that center to learn that you're safe as well. But that's where your hardwiring for learning when you're in danger is, and your memory systems in your brain for remembering what happens in time, like what happened just before this, just before this, just before this, and what happened next. We call that temporal memory and spatial memory. So what was in the room? Was it behind me? Was it beside me? Was it in front of me? That is all run by part of the limbic system and the hippocampus. Brain part again. Help me see this. The hippocampus is curled right in through here and links to this little wall right here. It's this little system between the amygdala and the hippocampus that teaches you not only what to be afraid of, when to be afraid of it, and where things are. And what we now know for sure over the last 20 years is that the very hormones we're hoping are going to help us, cortisol under stress, they actually destroy cells in the hippocampus. And the reason that was relevant to us in post-traumatic stress disorder is because when we scan the brains of people who've been through too much trauma, their hippocampi are smaller, they've shrunk. We know that in animals, if we give them high doses of corticosterone or prednisone, they can, in non-human animals, so rats and mice, if we give them corticosterone, which is their equivalent of cortisol, they forget where they are in the maze. They can't remember the memory. And their cells get damaged. The dendrites let go when the neurons are touching. We call those little fingerlings that they touch on, dendrites. And they're very specific cells in the hippocampus. They're called CA3 cells. It's a fancy name. But they're the cells that are key for coding the timing of memory, and they don't function under stress. And we think that's highly adaptive in animals because thinking under stress isn't adaptive. It takes too long. The animal's really wired to freeze, run away, or fight. So some animals are more prone to just freezing. We call it deer in headlights when we see it in people. It's adaptive for a deer to freeze if it's being hunted in the woods because then you may not see it. It's not moving. And a predator may not see it. The hunter may not see it. It's maladaptive when the deer is on the highway because the truck's still going to hit it when it stops. But that's all run by this brainstem function in the brain. We have that response.
Okay, Dr. Morgan, and we'll, what I'd like to do now is try to relate this a little bit more back to to this case, if we could. How does the effect of stress chemically affect your ability to reason?
At low levels of stress, and it can facilitate memory, and it can help you think a little more quickly. When stress reaches what we call critical levels of stress or traumatic stress, some people call it critical incident stress, when you feel like your life's in danger or somebody else is in danger, your system is activated so much that we know then that cortisol and norepinephrine they impair decision making because they're actually taking away, they're shutting down the hardware that you need to use for reasoned decision making. So people say, I wish I would have thought of that under stress. We now know most people can't. We're really interested in the special operations community when we do selection. There are a tiny group of people who do really well under stress, and we keep picking those guys, and we're studying them to try and figure out their neurobiology. Why can they keep this functioning under stress? And we have a few clues about it, and one's related to that little chemical that says neuropeptide Y. Some of the special operations community people make a third more of it than the rest of us. We know it's related to a genetic mutation, but we all don't usually have it. So most of us lose all of this when we're under stress, and that impairs decision making.
Sure. How does it affect perception?
Dramatically. Under high stress, I've measured alterations in perception both in the lab and out at the military survival school, and when we were in Afghanistan and in other parts of the world. The fancy term for alterations in perception, in my field we call it dissociation. What it refers to are alterations in perceptions of the world around you and even of your own body. So the kinds of things people will report experiencing are their arms and legs may suddenly be longer or shorter than they really are. They may actually feel like they've separated from their body and they're looking down at it. They'll say everything happened in a moment, in a flash, or it went into slow motion. They'll develop tunnel vision. They'll say the whole world became about that big. Other people will say, suddenly it felt like I was looking at the world through a fisheye lens. Colors will get brighter, or they'll completely fade and people will see the world in black and white. Sounds will actually vanish under high states of cortisol and adrenaline. It's related to another chemical in your brain called glutamate. And as that turns over in your brain, we know that that's creating those specific symptoms. But the subjective experience, if you have those symptoms, is that you're disconnecting from the world around you. Sometimes they do it in horror movies to try and make you feel frightened when the camera feels like it's zooming in and twisting and pulling away. That's a filmmaker trying to give you that sense. But if you've ever been in a really harrowing experience, you may have had some of those symptoms where you didn't know something had hit you, you didn't see something, you didn't hear something, you didn't hear anybody calling your name. So it alters our visual perception, our auditory perception, our sensations. You actually don't feel pain as much when you're under high stress. Some people who get shot don't even know they've been shot. They don't know they've been injured or cut. It's called stress-induced analgesia. And that's because under stress, the way our brains are wired is it shuts down everything that's not essential. Your immune system gets turned off, Your GI system gets turned off. That's why some people throw up and they evacuate their bowels. Your brain is really wired to say, I've got to pay attention to the most important thing. Keep your eye on whatever's the threat and either freeze, run away, or eliminate the threat. It's very, very fast. It's not deliberative thinking at all. But under that stress, the world around you will feel very, very different. And we see that now in everyone. We used to believe in my field, in PTSD back in the 90s, it was even in what we call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. One of the things was called an acute stress disorder. It was a diagnosis we could give people. And we believed that if you had those symptoms when you were in a car accident or whether you were assaulted or something, that would predict that you were going to go on to get PTSD. And we thought, well, this is neat. Forgive me, but doctors, we get excited about predictors of illness. And we go, this is neat because maybe then I can help a person ahead of time. It turned out not to be true. What I found out when I began to do our research with the Army and the Navy and the Marines, that when you can give people more stress than you can in our lab, everybody will have those symptoms. No one's immune to them. And so when we hear those symptoms in people, what we now know, because we've measured the blood levels and those symptoms through a whole series of experiments since 1993, we now know that those tell us that your system has been really activated up if it's altering your perceptions of the world around you. But it's absolutely normal and absolutely consistent to have people tell you, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything, I have no idea what happened between here and here. And when there's holes in people's perception or holes in their memory, it's the norm. It's exactly what we see in studies with human and non-human animals. They don't know where they've been in a maze, and people don't know where they've been in a maze or in a building.
And Dr. Morgan, how does it affect then, you mentioned a little bit, two questions. What is the importance of training? Okay. Let's start with that, in order to deal with a situation where you're under high stress.
Training is usually designed both for medical students or military folks or law enforcement folks or firefighting folks, anybody who's going to be working under high stress. Most training is designed around an idea of what we call stress inoculation. It's sort of after the idea about getting a vaccination. If you get a little dose of something, your body's better protected in the future. And the idea is that by exposing you to something similar to what you might experience in the future, it will take away the immediate novelty of when you experience it in the future, and that it won't alarm your neurobiological system as much, because our system really fires up dramatically when it's unknown, it's novel, and it makes us frightened. So the more familiar we are with something, it lets the system fire a little less. And that's what we hope when people get repeated exposure to training, that we're desensitizing their system. And that's to make them less reactive and then practice all the behaviors we want to see from them when they're under stress. Because once again, under stress, you're really reduced to that subpart of your brain and anything that you've rehearsed. And in the military, they always said you're going to think outside the box under stress. As early on as 1999, when I'd consult with the Special Operations Command, we had so much data on it, and thousands of people were like, no one's getting smarter under stress. If they do not practice it, it's really unlikely you're going to see any new, novel, creative behavior under highly intense stress. Now, if the stress is moderate, that can help people. But when it's under this threat to life experience, most everyone's running on whatever they've done before. They try something that they've done before.
And what about memory? How does this process affect memory of stressful events in a person who experiences it?
In low stress, we know that small doses of adrenaline enhance memory. You know, if you're a little bit motivated and frightened about an exam and you study, you learn it better. If you learn something, get on the treadmill, you can actually enhance your memory if you pump up some adrenaline after you studied something. We know that facilitates the encoding of memory. But under high stress, it's debilitating to memory. And that's because memory is made up in three phases. There's an encoding phase of how we get the information in our brain. Then it has to be transformed from what we call scratch pad memory or short-term memory into long-term memory so we can remember it over time. So you may not remember what you were doing at 3 32 in the afternoon 5 weeks ago. You might, but unless it was extraordinary, you might not know exactly what you're thinking. But you did at some point. That memory's just gone. It's like the cards. Most people can't tell you what they were doing 24 hours ago at a specific moment in time unless it was an exceptional thing that they were paying attention to. So when people are under stress, it changes their attention on what they're tracking. And we know you have to be paying attention to get the information in your brain. And then we know under stress that it is also competing and impairing our ability to encode the memory, because it's usually a survival mode that you're in under super high stress. And high doses of adrenaline, they disrupt the conversion from short-term to long-term memory. So one of the characteristics we know about human memory is that you can learn it, and if it gets into your memory system, we can probably get some of that memory back. But your memory is not going to improve dramatically over time unless you got the information from somewhere else. One of the features of memory is we call it transience, is that it will fade. You'll either keep what you got or it fades. The other feature about our memory is once we have it in storage, it's a little like your phone in one sense. If you have an Apple phone and you find out it upgraded over the night when you plugged it in and you weren't quite sure it was going to do that, your brain does an upgrade on information and can change your memory over time when you learn new things. And it doesn't require a conscious decision. We know that when you bring a memory back up and you're talking about it to someone, that memory is being recreated in your brain. It's not just opening a file like you have on your computer. It's reassembling it, and that memory is recreated based on the mood you're in and any new information you learned in the meantime. So memory is very dynamic. It's not static. It's very fragile early on, and the very thing that helps us survive can really disrupt it from being preserved. So our memory can be really crude. In our studies with the folks at survival school and the folks at Yale, I used to give people electric shocks and look at reaction times and what makes them frightened and how to learn fear. If we alarm people too much, they can't unlearn something. They can't learn that they're safe. It disrupts their ability to take in new information and adjust and respond in time.
Okay, Dr. Morgan, turning to a situation where perhaps a policeman is facing a threat that he believes could be a deadly threat, can you just step us through a very abbreviated Cliff Notes version of what might be going on, what might be affected, and what the outcome of that could be?
So I've measured this kind of thing mainly in military folks doing what we call close quarters battle training, running into the houses, trying to find out where the bad guys are, shooting back at them. Essentially, it's becoming a shoot, don't shoot task is what we're measuring. And so what's going on in your brain, first and foremost, is it a threat or not? Do I know it or not? And is it a threat or not? Those are the first two things everyone's brain does, whether you're aware of it or not. Your fear and alarm system gets activated right away. Say, am I in danger or not? Then depending on how fast things are moving and how much stress you're under, people then begin to evaluate the nature of the threat that they're under and how immediate it is. But that's usually the first process that's going on, is trying to calm down, settle down, and focus under stress.
And assuming that that has been evaluated and the stress level continues to rise, what happens next?
After that, mainly people move into reflexive behavior. It's very automatic. Some people will freeze. So when I do selection and assessment, and we'll see really good people, when you raise the stress level, they actually can't respond. They can't fire the weapon. They delay for 3, 4, or 5 seconds, and then they're out, because if you delay, you die in those situations. So the people who are selected into these special units that are supposed to go at targets and get bad people, they're responding really reflexively and responding with this very primitive portion of their brain. The overthinkers don't last in the programs. So as the stress goes up, you're being reduced more and more to really automatic responding, and that may be by just freezing, not doing anything. It may be just by running away, and it may be by moving at a target. But those are our three options as humans.
And what about the physiological effects that you talked about as far as the dissociation? Is that taking effect at that point?
Yes, that's happening at the same time. Dissociation is a little like the head on the beer. If you say the real important stuff is what's in the beer, the foam on top of the beer is all that subjective stuff about lights getting brighter and more colorful or distant or faded. They're not helping you survive. It's just a side effect of the experience of being under adrenaline. We've actually evaluated whether or not dissociation is adaptive. Does it help? And the only thing we've seen is that in little rabbits and mice, and we think maybe in people, that if you freeze and dissociate completely and stop responding, your cortisol comes back down, but you've mentally withdrawn from the scene, which is extraordinarily maladaptive if you're in a profession that's supposed to be responding to threat. So there may be something helpful in the end about dissociation, but it is not helpful in a profession where you have to respond to a threat.
How about your ability to make and then maybe rescind a decision?
Under stress, the part of your brain you're running on, it's fast. You don't have time to second guess things when you're operating at that level. Your prefrontal lobe, when this area shuts down, it takes too long.
How do you mean by too long? Give us an example of one.
So in some experiments, depending on the stress level, people can't kick in their frontal lobe functioning for 10 to 15 seconds. If we raise the adrenaline even higher, it may be a half an hour. We have some people, if we raise the stress high enough, you can knock out executive functioning for 4 hours. So people do vary, and that's what we count on in selection. We vary in that, but in really rapid things, like within a millisecond to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds, that behavior is pretty automatic. And if your frontal lobe's not on, that's what you use. That's the brake. And if it's offline, we haven't seen people be able to inhibit a response. So the way we test this in the lab, we have little button presses, and when you get the signal, you're supposed to stop pushing the button. But if we stress you, you'll even start to giggle a little bit because I can't stop hitting it. You perseverate in the behavior because your frontal lobe's not letting you inhibit it. We think that may be related to why people fire more than even they think. So in the soldiers that I study, they rarely can tell you how many shots they fired off. Their sense of timing in it is way off. They always think, oh yeah, I took 3 minutes to do that. It happened all in 20 seconds or less. But when that area of your brain kicks up, when this is turned off, it can't make you reassess in the moment. It sounds like a nice idea, but it doesn't happen under really high stress.
And are there any physical symptoms for people who've been under very high stress? In other words, objective physical symptoms to those on the outside as opposed to what someone is physiologically feeling on the inside?
There can be. When people have symptoms of dissociation, if you're around them, sometimes you can pick up on the sense that they're kind of lost in their head or they act confused. They say funny things. They say things that don't quite make sense. They may laugh inappropriately, or they just may look very, very, very flat. So the way we check on dissociation when we're looking at people is we try and interact with them. But it can be difficult if you're just looking at someone to know where the level is. You'd have to know how they described their behavior. But if they're suffering from a lot of symptoms of dissociation, their performance is usually off. They're not hitting the right targets. They're not solving the problem sets in the right way. They're not giving the right answers. And then later, they're not sure why they did that. They're unable to account for what they said or what they did because their brain's been offline.
And are there memory disruptions after a stressful event?
Yes. There are.
And how do they manifest themselves? Is it linear? Is it episodic or periodic?
It can be fairly immediate. It's so common that we included it as one of the symptoms that survivors of trauma can have, which is they're missing memory for critical details of what happened to them. It's actually one of the symptoms we look for in post-traumatic stress disorder, that people are unable to remember key aspects of the sexual assault or the combat experience. So it's extraordinarily common. They can have no memory for what happened for a period of time. That was important when we talked to doctors, because in my profession, we had a habit of trying to help people go find their memory. And in the 1980s and 90s, there was a whole series of lawsuits on recovered memory. And we stopped telling people to go find a memory because they'll end up inventing one. Sometimes there's just no memory. That's most often the case because the hardware isn't working under really high stress. So it can affect memory right away.
And does the stress fundamentally affect the way a person's personality or persona? Is there a Jekyll and Hyde aspect to stress?
Under stress, stress tends to bring to light sort of just who you are. Since you're resorting to habitual, routine response behavior, if someone has been traditionally, let's say, disorganized, confused, or a hothead or something like that, then stress may accentuate those things. If you have someone whose personality style is such that they've been methodical, careful, logical, things like that, and they've practiced that behavior over time, because that's what personality is. Personality is behavior we've done over and over and over that makes us consistent. Stress pushes us to resort to what we usually do. So you don't discover a new person. Under stress, you're usually running into the ingrained patterns either from training or behavior. Sometimes if people have had really dramatic brain damage, or if there's been permanent damage to some of these parts of the brain, then people can have a personality transformation after their brain's been injured, and family will say this is not the same person anymore. Either they're too docile or now they're too irritable. But most of the time under routine stress, we end up seeing the regular personality patterns that we selected on. So in the military, we do selection and assessment. We interview people, screen them in and out, to sit in front of a board to get in the units. And we've been able to validate that information over the last decade, saying, what are the predictors of what gets them into the club, into the special unit? How did they do in the special unit? How well did they do under stress? And we know that those personality features are stable, and they are the best predictors of who will do well. But that's what we understand now from our data.
So under a high-stress situation, you sometimes lose the ability to reason because you lose the frontal lobe?
Yes.
And
yes. You lose executive function. Yep.
Executive function. And you have perceptual distortions?
That's correct.
There is sometimes a loss of memory.
Yes.
And it is not a recoverable event within seconds.
That's correct. Your frontal lobe doesn't kick back in seconds. If you've been under critical stress, in the lab, if we stress you with a little bit of a tiny stressor, your functioning kicks back in. But at the levels of adrenaline I'm talking about, like what we see at the SEER school, where we think it's closer to realistic threat to life events, no, it doesn't kick back in right away. And as I say, most people, it takes a good 15 minutes to get your frontal lobe coming back online, because most people aren't under stress for like a 30-minute period. So in some of my studies, people are being interrogated for a half an hour or waterboarded or something. And the more severe and intense that stress, the longer it takes for them to recover. But the average, if the stress has been realistic and the adrenaline's been up, so the immune system's shut down and we think they're under that I need to fight for my life sort of thing, it's not sooner than 15 minutes.
And a sort of a Swiss cheese memory of events would not be unusual?
Actually, that's the norm. When I interview trauma victims, victims of trauma rarely have a narrative memory, a story that makes complete sense. If I hear one of those, I generally think someone's been helping them fill it in. The norm is that memory it's spotty. Sometimes there's reversals in it. and some things just don't make sense, and the person is usually kind of confused about that. They don't understand why. The reason why in my field this is important is because many times victims of trauma are misunderstood even by the police who interview them, and they have interpreted the holes in memory as the victim's lying. So part of our education for victims of trauma, and they've generally been women who suffered sexual assault, is we want them to be believed, and we want the police that we train to understand that these are not signs of lying or hiding something. This is how memory works. You have other evidence that might indicate lying, great, but in and of itself, just looking at a memory that's fragmented or has holes is normal, and we've seen that in non-human and human animals. And we train doctors in that now so that they don't start being suspicious of their patients, and so we can do good work with them. But it's the norm.
And Dr. Morgan, I'm going to hand you what's been previously marked for identification as Defendant's Exhibit 82. And I'd ask you to see if you recognize that document. If so, we can turn to page 18 of the document.
Yes, it's been a while, but I do recognize it.
And starting, what is that document?
It's a CJA lesson plan on how to prepare people, usually law enforcement personnel or someone who's going to be in emergency services, to train people on what may happen to them under stress, to prepare them for performing under stress. It's some of the language is slightly different than I would use when I'm talking to medical people. So some of the terminology around physiology is put into a little bit more layman's terms, but the basic idea is one of stress inoculation. And the idea is that by educating people when they're doing this training and saying, look, when your adrenaline's up, your hand may shake, fine motor skill ability will go away. If your heart rate's too high and your adrenaline's too high, those ideas are driven by what we know is helpful to people under stress. The more sense they can make of what's going on with their own body and the world around them, then they're generally less stressed. So if we tell you ahead of time, don't worry, while you're doing this, if your arms and legs suddenly feel really short or really long, or the colors fade, you don't have a tumor in your head, you're not crazy, it's a side effect of your adrenaline. We're hoping by educating you about that, or your hands are shaking, it doesn't mean you're frightened, it's a side effect of high adrenaline, high sympathetic charge, that knowledge can help you squelch or contain that fear and alarm system, because there's a degree of familiarity. So the overall principle of this training is about educating people and stress inoculating, and then having people practice something we're hoping they're going to do and think and feel under stress. It's the foundation of lots of law enforcement and military training.
And so that is taught, that's the basic course at the Criminal Justice Academy, taught to all the people who go through there, that you may experience some of these effects caused by the onset of high stress.
Yes.
Court's indulgence.
Stand for a moment, everyone.
And Dr. Morgan, you were in here today to witness the testimony of Officer Slager.
I was.
And not to get in the mind of Officer Slager or try to second guess Officer Slager, but are the descriptions of what he observed and what he remembers consistent with the descriptions of someone who has experienced a high stress event like we just discussed?
Yes.
Thank you. Please kindly answer any questions that the solicitor might have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Good afternoon.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm losing my voice, but I mean, it's fine. So, excuse me if I cough and wheeze. It's
That's okay.
it's the season.
You are, and I don't mean to insult, rather verbose person, a wordy person.
Oh, I am.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm an extrovert.
I'm going to ask you, please don't take offense to this, but if you'll just answer the questions that I ask, and you know, if you feel you need to explain, that's fine. But you know, maybe tim it in a little bit for time.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't mean any offense. I'd like to start. I'm a little just some clarification about where sort of our role and yours intersect, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I'd like to maybe pose to you a couple of scenarios and so I'm not confused about what you're telling the jury. Is that all right?
Okay.
Okay. A husband and a wife are in a very heated argument, and the wife begins throwing dishes at the husband. And the husband reacts, and this is some awful stuff, by strangling the wife to death. Would you come testify that he had done nothing wrong?
What do you mean by done nothing
Well, let me
wrong?
explain.
As a psychiatrist, I don't think I'd be
That man
asked
has
that.
an adrenal gland, correct?
Adrenaline, if you're having a significant fight with someone, your adrenal glands will be releasing adrenaline.
And the norepinephrine would be released in that scenario, likely?
It would be, yeah.
And part of the brain that you took great pains to explain to the jury, taken over, would have taken over?
Yes. Depending on the level, but yes.
And again, this is,
Yeah.
and I don't think you're trying to say this, but this is what I'm trying to clarify. But you're not saying in that scenario that the husband did nothing wrong, right?
Again, as a psychiatrist, I wouldn't comment on whether it was right or wrong.
Right, and that's what we need to clarify. Thank you. A gang member is walking down the street and sees a rival gang across the street coming the other way. Words have been spoken. Back and forth. You know, maybe the arms aren't clear. That, a gang member has an adrenal gland, right?
Yes, we hope so.
All of these processes in that scenario that you've explained to this jury as perhaps happening to Mr. Slager are happening to a gang member in that scenario too, right?
Depending on the frequency,
Right.
it could be, yes.
Could be in a situation of stress like that.
Yes.
Gang member pulls out a gun, shoots the other guy.
Yeah. We would consider that a critical incident or like a traumatic stress.
Right. And you would consider it a critical incident, and we and us might consider it still a crime.
You might, yes, yeah.
Even a more horrible scenario, a man is running from a police officer. And maybe this man perceives that police might harm him. Okay? But not commenting whether that's true or not, but that's the perception. The man has an adrenaline gland, right? Most likely.
Most likely,
Or
not,
it's
yeah.
extreme scenario. The same chemicals you've described in that situation are surging, right?
Yes, it
His-
could be, yeah.
Forgive me, I'm not.
Yeah, no,
The part of the brain that reasons, what is
Yeah.
that again, the frontal lobe?
Yeah, it's your frontal lobe.
Okay. Frontal lobe shuts down in that scenario, right? Possibly.
It could, yes. It would depend on the eye of the beholder, you know, the person.
The man pulls a gun and shoots a police officer. As horrible as that is to imagine. He's done something wrong, right?
He could have done something wrong, yes. As I say, as a psychiatrist, we don't comment on the law.
Correct.
We're usually asked to comment on how to understand a person, you know, in a context, so.
And your testimony is fascinating about how to understand the person, but it is definitely not your testimony to this jury that negates moral culpability, is it?
No,
It's not part
the
of your
jury,
business.
jury has their own job.
Right.
I believe I'm here to explain sort of how this organ works, and
And
they
the
have to think
processes
about
that
that.
you've so confidently explained to this jury about that are the type of processes that might happen in any crime that a jury considers, is that correct?
Depending on
Stress level.
the stress level, yeah. If we put it in that category of extreme stress, then we tend to believe that everybody's got that neural wiring, those mechanisms that happen. If the stress is routine, a little more familiar, it may not be quite as stressful. You'd have to look at somebody's background to see if they've routinely been in combat year after year after year, or exposed to, say, maybe gang activity year after year after year. It might not be as shocking as it would be to someone who's never seen it before, or this is their first event. The more novel the event, the less experience you have in the event, the more activating it will be to your system. That's why we think stress inoculation should be helpful, right? So,
But in
yes,
any of these type of scenarios, these functionings of the brain can happen in any of those more sort of common criminal matters. Stress levels can be high in a criminal situation.
yes, they could.
And to the best of your knowledge, that does not legally negate legal responsibility.
Again, that's something, it depends on what people offer as a defense. So I might be called, if someone put forth a mental health defense, to explain the person if that was the defense they were using. But again, that's out of my area. That's not
And
what
you
I'm
offer
trained in.
me, thank you, a great segue to my next question. You've already offered to this jury several ways one might go about determining if a person has in fact reached sort of this critical level of stress. You said that how you know might be during the experience, colors and sound, I'm sorry, I'm taking this from a paper, not your paper, not the testimony. During the experience, colors and sound seem to change in their intensity. Is that correct?
Yes, those are symptoms of dissociation. Yeah.
During the experience, things appear to be moving in slow motion.
Yes, they can move in slow motion.
During the experience, the subject may feel separated from their body as if watching things from above the scene.
That's correct.
You've added to that in your testimony, arms and legs, maybe T-Rex arms,
Yeah.
may feel shorter or longer.
Yeah, people will report, yeah, they can feel 10 feet tall, or they can report other people appear even bigger than they are. It's just a visual and body perception distortion.
People may experience tunnel vision.
Yes,
Colors may be brighter.
yes,
Colors may be duller.
correct.
People may, in the light of this, if they're under this critical level of stress, may inappropriately laugh, be
Yes.
inappropriately jocular. Right?
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of science around very dark humor under stress, whether it's in doctors or military folks, which can sound really inappropriate to other people, but it's under high stress, people say these things, or they laugh, or they grin in a silly way when it's supposed to be serious. Those are all well-documented human behaviors due to stress.
People may throw up if they reach this critical level.
They can, yes.
People may, what's the phrase you use? They may have a bowel movement.
Yeah, they can wet their pants, or they can evacuate their bowels in their pants. I've interviewed victims of trauma and also soldiers in combat who've had that experience. The adrenaline was just so high. It's confusing to them, but it just means it's really skyrocketed to a degree they've never had before, and that's how their body responds.
So that seems to cover about 10 to 12, forgive me, different indicia of a person reaching this critical level of stress.
Yes, and there's more.
Oh, there's more.
Yes.
Sure. Well,
There's at least 19 of them that we look at in clusters.
Okay.
Some are related to, sometimes you won't even recognize yourself in the mirror. People will look in the mirror and they don't know who the other person is. Flash in a moment, and at the same time, they'll have the feeling like time stretched. Yeah, so
So
there's a wide range of them.
about 19 different indicia that a person reached this critical level of stress. To my knowledge and yours, I know you were here, none of which Michael Slager described on this.
I didn't hear him describe those today. I've heard him
Any of the
describe those.
19 indicia
Yeah.
that a person has reached critical stress level, of those we just recounted,
Yeah.
bowel movements, throwing up,